Good morning. We're going to continue our class that we started. Um, Good heavens, we started Kings long ago, but this is First Kings, chapter 19 and 20, as we continue looking at God's amazing word. I'm going to bring up, as always, the slide deck to get us started. And Malek Aleph, chapters 19 and 20, First Kings, and just a little bit of review from last week. We once had a united kingdom of Israel and Judah that has now completely split into the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. Israel will be referred to both as Israel, the northern kingdom, also as Samaria. And Samaria becomes this very specific connotation for the northern tribal peoples, and especially later in the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and they'll talk about that in the pejorative, or that, to be like Samaria is to be backslidden. And of course, Israel has its issues. We're going to cover a lot of that. The theater has been introduced to the first great biblical prophet, Elijah, and we will now get introduced to Elisha, his young apprentice that he is going to appoint, but he's got some adventures ahead. If we recall from last week, we had this great showdown, and it's because if we go over here to the list of the kings, let me try to zoom in here a little bit. We have this split. There's Solomon. His son Rehoboam is supposed to be king over the united kingdom, but the northern kingdom rebels. And so Jeroboam the first becomes king of the north, Rehoboam of the south. And Jeroboam introduces, if you recall, the worship of some sort of cult figure, both at Bethel, and at Dan. And this causes him to lose the kingdom. And then a series of coups occur. And finally, Omri, whose son Ahab, or Akav in the Hebrew, becomes king of Israel. And he forms a very strong alliance with the Phoenicians. He marries one of the Phoenician king's daughter, Jezebel, and they are into all kinds of bad stuff. And she brings down with her the Phoenician worship of Baal Melkor and Ishtarah, or Ashtoreth. And Rehoboam will have a son. He won't reign for very long. Asa will become a good king, Jehoshaphat. All of this occurring during the Omri, Ahab, and then finally the destruction of Ahab and Jezebel. And we'll start to read about that, God's plan. There will be a series of kings of Israel. They'll continue to get worse and worse, as will there be a series of kings of Judah, some good, some bad, most of them not so good, as we progress through the narrative. On to the next slide. Just a quick focus. Omri had a son, Ahab. He had Ahab marry within a political alliance Ethabal, the king of Tyre's daughter, Jezebel, and they're going to have some sons. There will be a really unfortunate marriage between the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel and Jehoshaphat's son, the king of Judah, Jehoram, and that will bring great suffering to Judah as this philosophy, this religion, this Phoenician religion comes into the land. And it's a very disturbing practice, as we'll talk about. A little bit about the Phoenicians, as we talked about. They had a series of excellent ports. As the narrative here tells us, they greatly affected trade throughout the entire Mediterranean, particularly the southern half of the Mediterranean. The Greeks were notorious as the great traders of the northern half and had colonies in southern Italy called Graecia Magna, or Great Greece, and then also in Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. And so there was already great tension between a Levantine culture, Phoenician culture, Near Eastern culture from Tyre and Sidon on the big heavy trade routes with the Greek culture. And that conflict also produced tremendous amounts of collective trading. And the Greeks will adopt the Phoenician script. And we'll talk about another adoption of script that occurs. It's profound. But this is why we have the alphabet we have. It is the Phoenician alphabet. It is not Linear B or the older Greek alphabet, but Phoenician. And the Greeks adopted it. You can tell how that happened. They were great traders. They didn't particularly appreciate or like the Phoenicians, but they certainly figured out how to have business arrangements with them. And because of that, they decided that the Phoenician script, was very efficient, and it is. It's our alphabet today, and adopted it. And so the Phoenicians continue to have a tremendous effect on our world and our culture even today. They had a very disturbing religious practice. Baal Melkor and his concubine or his consort was Ashtaroth, and it was the sacrifice, human sacrifice, child sacrifice that occurred in this practice. Not always, but always the idea was you had to somehow get Baal's attention, and by doing that, you sacrificed something, and the issuance of blood brought about the awakening. Ashtaroth, his consort, was all about fertility and a classic Near Eastern cult fertility practice. Many believe they were cult prostitutes. This thing flows right into Greece and Rome, and you even pick it up from Paul in his writings in First Corinthians. He says to the Corinthians, how can you join yourself to a prostitute? And really the undertones there are going to a temple cultic prostitute practice. So it's a very horrendous religious practice, and Jezebel wants to bring this into the heartland of Israel. Again, very sophisticated. They had a very close link to the Egyptians. You can see that with the cartouches, very similar to the Egyptian. And as we read last week, finally it gets to the point where our prophet decides, listen, this practice, Elijah says this practice is ridiculous. So I'll meet you at Mount Carmel. You get your 400 prophets of Baal, your 400 prophetesses of Ashtaroth. I'll meet you at Mount Carmel, and we'll have a showdown. We'll just flat see who is the great God here. And of course, the wonderful passage that we read where he's taunting, the priests of Baal are getting excited. They can't seem to rouse Baal. They start slashing themselves, the flowing of blood. And finally, Elijah says, enough's enough, says a simple prayer. Down comes fire, consumes the altar, simple altar of 12 undressed stones of Elijah's sacrifice. He is literally filled by the Spirit. He tells Ahab, hitch up your wagon. You better get out of this area, especially get away out. In other words, here comes the rain, so the Jezreel Valley will flood. You better get on over to Samaria, your home. And sure enough, the floods come. He is so endued by the Holy Spirit that he runs faster than a man in a 2-horse chariot, Ahab, and gets to the gates of Samaria before Ahab gets there. And that is how inspired he's at the pinnacle of his victory that Adonai has produced, running faster than a 2-horse chariot. Well, that's not the rest of the story. And here we're going to pick up some of the narrative we'll read today and talk about. Achab, that's Ahab, told Jezebel, everything that Elijah, had done, and how he had put all the prophets to the sword. That Jezebel sent a message to say to Eliyahu, may the gods, plural, do terrible things to me and worse ones beside, if by this time tomorrow I haven't taken your life just as you took theirs. So she is not happy, and she has a vendetta to settle with Eliyahu or Elijah. On seeing that, he got up and fled for his life. So he goes from this pinnacle of great victory, the power of Adonai, wiping out this insurgent religious practice, and almost in a snap, by the threatening of one woman. I'm not saying that Jezebel wasn't imposing, but because of that, he flees in terror and he runs. And so, on seeing that, he got up and fled for his life. When he arrived at Beersheba in Yehuda, he sent his servants there, but he himself went a day further into the desert until he came to a broom or acacia tree. He sat down under it and prayed for his own death. Enough, he said. Now, Adonai, take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. And so here he goes from the height of his spiritual power and capability and literally crash lands out of the desert of the Negev. That's quite a story. And it doesn't stop there. He keeps right on moving. In fact, for some reason, I believe by God, he is propelled to travel all the way down to Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. And there in the utter wilderness, where Moses and the people of Israel were 500-600 years ago, a long time ago, he founds Mount Sinai, and he just waits. He doesn't know what to do. And I think we got to think about how our spiritual walk is sometimes. Sometimes we're on cloud nine. I mean, it's as if nothing can go wrong. Your faith is brimming. The results are there. And then it can turn in a dime. And then you're as low as it gets and you flee. So this tremendous, powerful, brave prophet literally runs away from this threatening woman. I'm not saying that Jezebel wasn't intimidating. I think she had great powers of intimidation, but still, she's just a woman, and she's not the God of Israel or of the universe. And yet he finds himself in the wilderness, far away as he's run away. And it's very interesting how God handles this. Then he laid down under the broom tree and went to sleep. You know, that's pretty exposed out in the desert. But when you're so tired and exhausted, mentally exhausted, emotionally exhausted, spiritually exhausted, you just kind of quit. And look what God does. Suddenly, an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on the hot stones and a jug of water. And he ate and drank. Then he lay down again. The angel came again a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank, and on the strength of that meal, traveled 40 days and nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. That's Mount Sinai. And so, God doesn't give him a lecture. God doesn't, here's all the things you've blown. What are you doing, you coward? He gives him water. He gives him, as it were, manna once again in the wilderness. And a 2-session meal lasts him for 40 days and for 40 nights. And that's how God works. And sometimes we just have to realize that we're tired and that we're worn out and that we need to let God fill us up again. Hopefully that's something that resonates with any that are listening to this class. And then here's what God has to say. Now, Adonai came to him. So after all of that, back to the mountain of God, back to Sinai, back to the beginning, if you will. And he says, Adonai came to him. "What are you doing, Eliyahu?" He answered, and boy, did he have an answer. "Well, I'm very zealous for Adonai, the God of hosts. The people of Israel abandoned your covenant, broken your altars, killed your prophets. And with the sword, I'm the only one left, and they're coming to kill me too." He said, Go outside, stand on the mountain before Adonai. There Adonai went past. A mighty blast of wind tore the mountains apart and broke the rocks in pieces before Adonai. But Adonai was not in the wind. After the wind came an earthquake. Adonai was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, fire broke out. Adonai was not in the fire. And after the fire came a quiet, small voice. When Eliyahu heard it, he covered his face with his cloak, stepped out, and stood at the entrance to the cave. Then a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Eliyahu?" Adonai said, "Go back through the Damascus desert, that's the great desert of eastern Syria. Anoint Hazael to be king over Aram." We're going to talk about the Arameans. And of course, they were centered in Damascus or Damascus. Anoint Yehu, the son of Nimshi, to be king over Israel. Anoint Elisha, the son of Shaphat, to be prophet after you. Yehu will kill whoever escapes the sword of Hazael. Elisha will kill whoever escapes the sword of Yehu. I have 7,000 in Israel, every knee that hasn't bent before Baal and not kissed him. And so God wraps up this session by saying, you have no idea what I have planned. You have no idea what power I control. You just now need to listen and follow my directions, and something great's going to happen. But I recognize something here very important. It's time for you to move on. You are tired, you are spent, and it's time for someone else to take this mission that I have begun to root out that particular evil. And so off he goes. If you look at the map here presented, you can see, and I want to introduce really for the first time, that there is emerging a great power. You know, the United Kingdom occurred because Egypt was so weak. The entire Hittite kingdom disappeared, literally, we think by famine and disease. And everybody over here, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Sumerians, all weak, weak, weak. But now the Assyrians start to get their act together. They start emerging. And another group of people, the Arameans, start to get strong in what is today Syria, around Damascus and on up through what's called Bet Adin, up through Hamath. And these begin to be a great trouble to Israel. In fact, the Arameans love to come in from Damascus, invade through what is called the Golan, into the Galil or Galilee, and raid Samaria. And so this is a big issue for the king of Israel, any of the kings of Israel. And the Arameans were a very capable, very strong people. Very quickly they put together very effective war machine with chariots. Their chariots had adapted to the latest to where they were iron. They were lighter than even the Egyptian war chariot. And they had a platform where two archers could be on a single chariot. And so they were very effective, and they began to seize control. And you can see great archers. That is the beginning of what we see as the compound bow. Very powerful, a lot of power. You can shoot really with a compound bow. You have the range of almost 100 yards plus. And so great horse warriors. And so they begin to really control that area. And then something very, very important, as I mentioned earlier, where the Greeks picked up Phoenician, the alphabet, the script for the Greek language, something happened here where the old cuneiform, the standard that had been around almost at that time 4,000 years, maybe 3,500 years, it had been used by the Sumerians, by the Akkadians. It would be used by the Babylonians. It would be used by everybody, just as standard script. But something happened. The Arameans also developed a particular script called Proto-Aramaic, and suddenly it seems the entire Near East adopted it because it was so much more efficient than writing out all of these little, triangles here, triangles there, chop, 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 chop. It was elegant. It was easy. And this is how Aramaic became not only the language, but really the script that everybody would use until the time of Alexander the Great. So on through the Assyrian experience, through the Babylonian, through the Persian. The Persians used the Aramaic script, and it became the language of everyone in the Near East. This is why Jesus spoke Aramaic and perhaps even wrote in Aramaic. And what happens is the script of Aramaic, from Proto-Aramaic to Aramaic, begins to look like, and you can see where Hebrew also picked up this later Aramaic script. And that's why to this day, if you read your Hebrew scriptures and you come to Esther especially, it's actually in Aramaic. And so close is the script between Aramaic and Hebrew. Profoundly affected the Hebrew language, profoundly affected God's people, became the lingua franca, if you will, of the Near East until the time of Alexander the Great and his conquest. Very, very important. So I wanted to bring that to our attention. Not that this was effective for a very long time, but it took a great amount of very highly trained scribes to get it right. Not only did you have to have a trained scribe to write it right, you had to translate it correctly. Whereas this script, now everybody could learn the language. So that's why Aramaic became so popular. And finally, as we read in the text, it's time for Elisha to be called. We'll read in the narrative how exciting that is. And it leads to kind of this end of chapter 20, where God begins to set up the destruction of the house of Ahab. They sat out at noon, and Ben-Hadad, now he's Aramaic, he's the Aramaic king, was drinking himself senseless in the field barracks. Well, that's a real smart thing to do when you're about to go to war. And the kings, the 32 kings who were his allies. So he had this great compact, this great confederation. The district governors went out first. This is from Samaria or Israel. Ben-Hadad sent for information, and they reported, men have come out from Shimron, that's also Samaria. He said, whether they have come out for peace or for war, take them alive. So the district governor's men left the city and followed by the army, and each one killed his man. Aram fled, and Israel pursued them. Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, escaped on horseback with some of the cavalry. The king of Israel went out and attacked the horses and chariots, inflicting a massive defeat on Aram. And so it's a little bit crazy, but God says to his prophets that this great king, Ben-Hazal, will inflict upon Israel the punishment that's coming. Well, before him, there's Ben-Hadad, the previous king of Aram, and he's an idiot. He's out drinking right noonday, right before battle, and guess what happens? He gets defeated. But this is in God's plan. And as always, when we see crazy things like this happen, God is using constantly the foolishness of man, the effects of nature, all kinds of things to bring about his good and perfect will. Now let's go to the narrative, and hopefully that gives some context as we read it, and we'll get through chapters 19 and 20 here. So it says, Akav told Isabel everything Eliyahu had done, and we read that on the slide deck, and so she says, well, I'm going to get you. And so, yes, as we read, on seeing that, he got up and fled for his life, and then there's the whole story that we'd already read in the slide deck about how he was refreshed by God. And then in the narrative there, he went into a cave and spent the night. The word of Adonai came to him. What are you doing here, Eliyahu? And that whole beautiful passage where God works with him. And I love it because finally it says, when Eliyahu heard it, he covered his face with his cloak, almost ashamed. He stepped out, stood at the entrance to the cave. And then that voice, that soft, still voice came and said, what are you doing here, Eliyahu? As God sometimes tells us, Phil, what are you doing in your life? What are you doing? And he goes on and explains all the great things he's doing. And then God, of course, corrects him and says, now here's what is really going on. And I want us to read this carefully again. Adonai said to him, go back by way of the Damascus desert, that's the Damascus desert, Syrian desert. When you get there, anoint Hazael to be king over Aram. So this Ben-Hadad, that's an idiot that we just read about, that decides to get drunk before a battle with Israel, is not who God says anoint. Rather, this Hazael, and we'll read about how that comes about. And again, whoever doesn't escape Hazael, you're going to anoint Yahu as the king of Israel, and whoever doesn't escape Yahu, Elisha, who you will appoint, is going to be there to make sure no one escapes. And then finally, oh, by the way, there's 7,000 souls that have not bowed down in any way, shape, or form to Baal or Ashtaroth. So let's get into chapter 20, because this really wasn't covered too much in the slide deck. So here's this Ben-Hadad. So Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, not who God tells Elijah to anoint, but this current king, rallied his whole army with him, 32 kings beside horses and chariots. They marched on Shomron and laid siege to it. He sent messengers inside the city to Achab, that's Ahab, and he said to him, here's a message from Ben-Hadad. Your silver and gold are mine, your wives, your best children, they're all mine. In other words, they're all mine. The king of Israel answered, just as you say, my lord king, I am yours along with everything I own. Messengers returned and said, here is Ben-Hadad's response. I sent you a message to hand over your silver, gold, wives, children to me, but I'm going to send my servants to you tomorrow around this time. They will ransack your house and the houses of your servants, and whatever they see they like, they will seize and remove. Then the king of Israel summoned all the leaders of the land and said, please take notice. Do you see how this man is trying to make trouble? First he demanded my wives, children, silver, gold, and I denied him nothing. All the leaders and all the people said to him, don't listen and don't agree. So he said to Ben-Hadad's messengers, tell my lord the king, I will do all that you asked me the first time, but this I cannot do. The messenger sent and brought word back. Ben-Hadad then sent his message to him, may the gods do terrible things to me, and worse ones as well, if there's not enough dust in Shomron to give each of my followers a handful. Oh, you've really made me mad. Now I'm going to come and really wipe you out. The king of Israel answered, tell him, he who is putting on his armor shouldn't boast as if he were taking it off. In other words, don't assume that you're going to win. It happened that Ben-Hadad received this message when he was drinking, that's from the slide deck, when he and his kings in the field barracks, he ordered his servants, take up your battle positions. So they got ready to attack the city. At that moment, a prophet approached Achab, king of Israel, and said, here's what the Lord Adonai says. Have you seen this vast army? I'm going to give you victory over them today. Then you will know that I am Adonai. Achab answered, who will defeat them? He answered, this is what Adonai says. The young men who serve the district governors. He asked, who will start the fighting? He answered, you will. He counted the district governors, the young men. There were 232. After that, he counted all the people. And all the people of Israel, there were 7,000. They set out at noon. Ben-Hadad was drinking himself senseless, as we read in the slide deck. And so it's just silly. So the governors come out. They begin to engage. The king of Israel went out and attacked the horses and chariots, inflicting a massive defeat on Aram. Afterwards, the prophets approached the king of Israel and said, go, regroup your forces, think carefully what to do. For next year at this time, the king of Aram will renew his attack. Meanwhile, the servants of Aram said to him, their God is the God of hills. That's why they were stronger than we were. But if we fight them on level ground, we will certainly be stronger than they are. Also do this. Remove all the kings from their commands and put professional officers in their place. Then recruit an army as big as the army you lost, horse for horse, chariot for chariot. We will attack them on level ground, and we will certainly be stronger than they are. He heeded what they said and acted accordingly. So this is like round two. And so at the same time, the following year, so now Aram's going to try it one more time. Ben-Hadad mustered the army of Aram and went up to Aphek to attack Israel. The army of Israel, already mobilized and supplied, went to meet them. But the army of Israel encamped opposite them, looked looked like two herds of goats, while Aram filled the land. That's pretty bad, two herds of goats. At this point, a man of God approached and said to the king of Israel, here's what Adonai says, because Aram said that Adonai is a God of the hills, but not a God of the valleys, I will hand over to you his entire huge army. Then you will know that I am Adonai. They remained in camp opposite each other for 7 days. On the seventh day, the battle began. The people of Israel killed 100,000 soldiers of Aram in a single day. The rest fled to Aphek into the city, and the wall fell on 27,000 of the men who were left. Ben-Hadad fled into the city, took refuge in an inside room. His servant said to him, here now we have heard the kings of the house of Israel are merciful kings. If that is all right with you, let's put on sackcloth around our waist, ropes on our heads, and go out to the king of Israel. Maybe he will spare your life. So they put sackcloth around their waists, ropes on their heads, and went to the king of Israel and said, your servant Ben-Hadad says, please spare my life. And he answered, he's still alive. He is my brother. The men took this as a promising indication and seized on it to say, yes, Ben-Hadad is your brother. Akab said, go and bring him here. Ben-Hadad went out to him. Akab had him climb up into his chariot. Ben-Hadad said to him, I will return the cities my father took from you. Also, you can set up markets for trade at Damascus, as did my father in Shomron. If you put this covenant in writing, said Akab, I will set you free. So we made a covenant with him and set him free. One of the members of the prophets' guild said to another one by word of Adonai, hit me. But the man refused to hit him. Then he said to him, because you didn't listen to the voice of Adonai, the moment you leave me, a lion will kill you. No sooner had he left him than a lion found him and killed him. The prophet went to another man and said, hit me. The man struck him a blow and wounded him. The prophet left and waited for the king by the road and disguised himself with a bandage over his eyes. As the king passed by, he pulled out to the king and said, your servant was on his way to the thicket of the fighting when someone turned, brought a man to me and said, guard this man. If he is missing, you will pay for his life with yours, or else you will pay 66 pounds of silver. But while your servant was busy with one thing and another, he disappeared. The king of Israel said to him, so that is your sentence. You have pronounced it on yourself. Quickly he removed the bandage from his eyes, and the king of Israel recognized him as one of the prophets. Then he said to him, here's what Adonai says, because you have let escape the man I had given over to be destroyed, you will pay with your life for his life, your people for his people. The king of Israel returned home to Shomron resentful and depressed. That's how chapter 20 ends. And so we have this interesting thing going on where Ben-Hadad is an idiot king of Aram, but almost loses all of his kingdom. But Ahab spares his life. Even when God has claimed you will have complete victory over him. And in so doing, he seals his fate, and we will see the demise of Ahab and Jezebel next week as we look at chapter 20. Well, thank you so much for being part of the class. As always, we enjoy talking through these things and have a great time of worship.